But, Mr. Speaker, I have signed over 9,747 letters to families and extended families who've lost loved ones in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that does include extended families as well. I do that every weekend so I can be reminded of my mistake of voting to give President Bush the authority to go into Iraq, a war we never had to fight. It was manipulated by those within the administration, and it was never had to be.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing fine, and we have a different type of program today.
Yeah.
It's sort of a sad program. At the same time, we have to put a happy light on it because we're going to be talking about the passing of Walter Jones, our good friend and a member of our board. And he has a fascinating career. He's a fascinating person that I very much respected. And there's a lot to celebrate about Walter Jones. And he was one of our first members joining the RPI, and he was a strong member. And the interesting part, about Walter was that he almost was like a neocon. He didn't fit in there, but he was very much pro-war. He represented Camp Lejeune and felt obligated to it. He had gone to a military academy, and he was very dedicated. When the war broke out against Iraq, he was annoyed that the French weren't joining in and sending troops, and he was the one that, now it's sort of funny about it. He said, we're going to change French fries to freedom fries. But he changed his tune. After a year or two of looking at the information, he changed his mind that he was deceived by our government. And although I think he overly punished himself, he took responsibility and changed his ways. And like the film shows, he tried to apologetically change what had happened. But he was he was very, very dedicated. He became very dedicated to peace, and this was not easy. This was something that he had to do. And his stories about his dedication to the military and to the people that died and were wounded. I mean, he wrote those letters, but he would go to the hospital and visit these people on a regular basis. So he was very dedicated. But the interesting thing is about Walter, the most rare thing that he did, so unusual in Washington, is somebody believes in something and they preach it and do it, and they're very, very excited about what they believe in, and somebody gives them different information and they change their tune. And the big thing was he discovered that those secret briefings that we would attend and they present to us by the CIA and the administration, he found out, he says, they were just giving us a pack of lies. Yeah. And that he remembered the whole time, and was the major reason why he switched from being pro-war and blindly pro-military to the point where he became anti-war and a real champion for peace.
And it's a question, what do you do when you have a crisis of conscience? Here he was going along to get along. He was a member of the Republican Party. He voted for the war. And all of a sudden, as you say, he realized he had been lied to by the administration. What do? Do you go along to get along? He could have been a chairman. He could have been a subcommittee chairman. He could have had a great career in the party. But he stood up for his conscience. He was furious. He was angry. And we could even see it 10 years later, Dr. Paul, when we talked to him. When it came up about how they lied to him, he was angry, visibly angry. So what did he do? He threw away all that. He threw away this, in some ways, at least how it would be obvious, he threw away his career as a great, promising Republican member of Congress to follow his conscience. I think that's such a great lesson for people. And guess what? The silver lining to a sad story is that he didn't lose anything. He prospered. He did better after doing that.
That is right. And he did lose his seniority on the Armed Forces Committee. He could have been a chairman. And if that had been his goal, to go to Washington and do whatever is necessary to become a chairman, he would have just swallowed up and gone along and get along. But no, he did have that crisis of conscience. He changed his way. And, Walter was interesting because, he lived in North Carolina. What was it, 6 or 8 hours drive? No, it's about 6 hours drive. He did it twice a week. He'd go back and forth, always in his car.
Yeah.
But he didn't waste his time. He always had an audiobook with him. And so I would say he was not well read, but he was well listened. He listened well. And the one book that he had told me, matter of fact, he had this author come up to Washington. I had lunch with Walter and this individual, and that's Jim Banford.
Yeah.
And his book was A Pretext for War. And that book was very explanatory and looked behind the scenes of why the lies were told. But Walter, was not bashful about blaming George W. Bush. Mm-hmm. But boy, he had even less respect for the vice president. So he let it out too.
He did, and we had Bamford over, and this is around the time when you initiated your Thursday luncheons. Remember the Texas luncheons were so pro-war that you were just getting furious, and so you said, I'm going to do my own lunch. And that's when we started inviting people like Bamford over. General Newbold came over, if you remember, former Joint Chiefs member. We had people like that come over. Walter was always there. He was always there for those lunches. He always took it on board, always listened to everything they had to say. He would tell his story over and over, almost like he kept having to try to get it off of his conscience each time,
Would you agree that our numbers weren't huge, but our quality was fantastic?
It was.
Our guests as well as the members that would come, because many would come. There was a couple that came for a free lunch.
But no,
many of them came because it was a serious discussion. It was off the record, and were persuaded to move in a direction which fit what my philosophy was, that people's the ideas and philosophy was more important than demagoguery and moving your way up in seniority in the system. So we of course thought that the luncheons were of very great value, but I don't imagine Walter ever missed. He was so dedicated, and but I can tell you one little story that he meant it to be funny, and I found it out to be a little bit funny. So when he and I were always very close friends, even before we got involved in the discussion of war or voting. It just happened that we sat together on the floor, and we were good friends. And he would frequently, in a kidding way, he would come up and say, Ron, I'm not a libertarian. So he wanted to, and he really wasn't a libertarian in the true sense of what we think. But he had great value because he became more libertarian than a lot of libertarians when it came to anti-war.
Yes.
And his story is so magnificent that it sent a message out. So, and Walter always moved in that direction because he was always studying and understanding what was going on, because I noticed over the years that going from a more typical conservative, he became much more libertarian on civil liberties too, and would join in. And the other thing that I liked working with Walter was because he had friends that were Democrats, and we worked on that. And of course, he was the one that in some type of polling that they did in the turn in the House, he was known as one of the most respected members of Congress, and yet he was the most despised when it came to the organization, and they wouldn't turn anything over to him. And so this is so he challenged the system. But one thing that I talked about, Jimmy Duncan had talked about, and Walter demonstrated, and that is he represented all these military people, and the assumption is, the propaganda is, you better vote for war. You better vote for this because you're going to lose your seat. So his mind was changed around 2004 or so. By 6 and 8, they were starting to recognize what he's doing. He wasn't quite as vocal, but he had. Then all of a sudden, the Republicans were gunning Republican leadership. So he had Republican opponents all along, and he had to struggle at times. But interestingly enough, Even the military understood what he was doing. They did not turn against him. And his last election, he didn't even have an opponent, which means that being against war isn't being against the military, and it isn't being un-American. It doesn't mean you're unpatriotic. He was able to show that standing on principle, working with Democrats and saying that peace is a good idea and that you don't have to be aggressive militant neocons and follow whatever our presidents tell us to do, you can survive politically. Matter of fact, I think long term, it's much more valuable, of course, that you can survive politically, but you also have a chance to convert people, and move them in a certain direction. I still think that in spite of all the propaganda, we complain about some of these votes in the Senate where 2/3 of the Senate will vote to not allow the president to even move troops out of a country and try to reduce it. So, but I think there's more support in the Congress. It's that they don't think the people will respond, in a positive way, and they see it as a political negative, and they won't take that chance. But I think there are more members of Congress. I think there are more people in the country too. I think there are more people on the college campuses that are anti-war, and we just need more people like Walter Jones. So we are going to miss him.
Yeah. And, like you, he drove them crazy because he was successful in a military district being against war. Just like it made them crazy that you had the most donations from active duty service people. They couldn't stand that, that drove them crazy. But I have a little Walter story if I can tell it. And it is such a strange and funny and great, perfect Walter Jones story. Back in the office, in the old office, you could always tell when a call didn't come through the switchboard. It came from a direct line from some other office. And I would be sitting there occasionally, I would notice that a call came from a direct line, and it was Walter Jones himself, very often. And this is something that didn't happen in Congress. Members maybe, if they had to, would talk to a chief of staff, but it was never something like this. He would call up, in his wonderful accent, Daniel, I'm looking at this legislation, I talked to my staff. I just want to check and see what you think about it. and Norman would joke that, we called him boss number 2 because he called pretty often. I just want to just check and see what you think about, and talk. And it was such an endearing thing for him. And it was, he didn't stand on this sort of ceremony of being a member. He reached out to everybody. He didn't care.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of stories like that, and I don't know whether they'll get into the Main Street media. I hope they cover him a little bit better. Sometimes they'll let bygones be bygones, and if he looks like he's a nice person, they will maybe build him up a little bit. But right now, I think they're not interested in the views, but they should be, and the people should be. That's why celebrating his life, I think, is so important. I wish that we could come up with some creative idea how we could honor him, and reassure people that they don't have to sacrifice their principles. And that's why I really like the idea. And all people have to do is go to the website and look at pictures. When we had press conferences, usually we had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, making the same point. So it is a bipartisan issue. But they keep talking about bringing people together in Congress. It's bipartisanship. But it's always by sacrificing your principle. You give us this, and we'll give you this, and we'll get in here, and everybody will get the mix. But it's never bringing people together on the left and the progressives who agree that we should defend civil liberties and anti-war positions, and come together with the libertarian and constitutional conservatives, because there's quite a few in the Congress who don't use the label libertarian, but they know. Jimmy Duncan was a good example of coming to the position he held by just being a constitutional conservative, and this is the kind of coalition that we want. I mean, you could just at least symbolically show how you can bring people together, and but then they probably would argue over powers some way. They'd find somebody to put a monkey wrench in it. But I think Walter should give us encouragement. That's what I think, because he was so positive, and I think he makes a difference. I think as time goes on, he's going to be known for the positions he held, and because he was a man of principle.
Yes. You know, the lesson for us all to learn from the life of Walter Jones is stand up for what's right no matter what. And don't let yourself be lied to, especially by the government. He was a great example to all of us. He will be sorely missed.
And I'd like to close with just emphasizing that as well, because it is so easy to be swayed in Washington. It starts the day after you're sworn in. To get your way, you have to do such and such, or we won't get money for your district, goes on and on. So there's a lot of room for people who want to invest some time and energy in trying to change people's mind by being involved in politics, but not with the expectation that you'll do whatever you need to do to raise enough money to work the system and do the, to work your way up through the ladder. That's a wasted time. That's a capitulation that makes things worse. And I think the people are ripe right now for people of principle to stand up. The biggest problem, of course, that we have for getting this message out is the total control almost of what the media portrays any individual, that might stand up for constitutional principles and for peace. It's just horrible how the mainstream media is so pro-war. It's understandable. I understand the way that happens. So it's a tough job, but it's always been a tough job to present the cause of liberty. And the other thing that we have to remember, Walter changed his mind because he realized that they were flat out lying to him and promoting death and destruction, and he felt so badly about that. And the bigger the empire is, the bigger the government is, the more trouble the government's in, the more economic troubles we have, and the more difficult it is to maintain an empire. Guess what happens? More lies have to be told. The empire and the huge government operation we have cannot operate by telling the truth. So that is what we're starved for, getting the truth and knowing it and understand it. And when the people hear it, they will change. And then I think Walter showed that. He didn't get kicked out of office because he voted the right way, and he was rewarded for it, and we all should be rewarded for Walter Jones having spent his time in Congress and setting a great example for all of us. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.